Well, it's finally come to this. 23 MCU movies over 11 years, forming a franchise still going strong to this day. How would I rank them from the worst one to the best one? Well, let's stick around and Welcome, geeks, nerds, and people who still live at their parents' house. This is the Nerd Zone. I'm your host, Lakin22, and today on Lakin22's Movie Chat, we're doing the big one. That's right. Today we are ranking the Marvel Cinematic Universe from the worst one to the best one. Now, as most of you know, I am a huge comic book fan and comic book enthusiast. In case you probably didn't know, but probably obviously realised up until now, I have comic books of all these characters. In fact, I've got tons of them from Marvel and DC. So you can tell I am a huge fan of them all. But out of all the comic book interpretations that we have got over the last few decades, there is one movie franchise that has interpreted them more faithfully than any of them. And we can thank that to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But a franchise that has been going strong even to this day, with 23 movies over 11 years, being more faithful than any other comic book interpretation of any other superhero that there can possibly be. It's like we're watching something ripped out straight from the comic books and onto the big screen. So we have a lot to look up to for this movie franchise. It will definitely inspire future movie directors and actors to pursue this particular genre. Now, obviously, as we know, there was a time when the comic book genre was unknown, and we thank the 1978 Superman movie for bringing it into the spotlight, and then we also got their sequels, the one good one and the two shit ones. Then we got the Batman Burton films with Michael Keaton from 1989 to 1992, and then they drastically went shit from Batman Forever to Batman and Robin. So while it got to the mid-90s, the comic book genre really started to bomb, especially for Marvel, since they started off really shitty with films like Howard the Duck, the 1990 Captain America, and obviously the Roger Corman Fantastic Four film from 1994. And it wasn't until 1998 where Blade came in and made the comic book genre popular again. And obviously we can thank other films like the original X-Men and the original Spider-Man films. But the one that really made it highly popular and profitable was arguably the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because from the first film Iron Man from 2008 to Spider-Man Far From Home of this year of 2019, they have made tons of money, spawned so many films, and yet it's got so much staying power, it doesn't look like there's any chance of it slowing down at all. So what we're going to do, since it's going to phase 4 of next year, I thought it could be no better time than to rank the three phases of movies from the worst to the best. Now, before we get started, I'd really like to point out that this is strictly opinion-based. So I don't want anybody getting too pissed off about my choices. This is strictly what I thought of how much I was entertained by the film, especially how it holds up, what entertained me the most, what I thought about it, and etc, etc. And don't forget to comment down below your ranking of the list and subscribe to my channel, because I really need some more subscribers. But anyway, enough chit chat, let's get to our first film. Here is our film in 23rd place. Yes, Ant-Man, released in 2015 and directed by Peyton Reed. Now, I know a lot of people think of this as a refreshing change of pace for the MCU, and that's exactly what it is, because after getting films like the Avengers, the Iron Man, Thor, and Guardians of the Galaxy being huge in scale, it is a refreshing change of pace for it to be slightly smaller in scale. And while I do agree with that, it's also what kills the movie for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy this film enough. I enjoy all of these films as their own separate thing, But this one I strictly just do not enjoy as much as the others because of its scale. Not its acting, not its visuals, not even that it's a small scale of film. That doesn't bug me. It's just the scale is not something that I'm used to. When I watch a comic book film, I'm used to it being huge and gargantuan in scale. And then when I went in watching this, it was a bit strange for me. And it's still something that I'm not used to yet. Because I really think this is too small of a scale for me to actually enjoy. And I do find that the humour and the directing and the acting is fairly well done. And the visuals are spectacular with the shrinking. But the scale has never been something that I've particularly enjoyed. Ant-Man has just been a small scale movie that was, while refreshing, was just boring for me. And I'm not saying that in the bad way. I do enjoy this movie, but compared to the rest of the MCU, it's one I would gladly skip over. But that's all I can say about this movie. It's good, but boring in my opinion because of its small scale. Anyway, that's enough of Ant-Man. Let's move on to our film in 22nd place. Yes, obviously, Thor: The Dark World, released in 2013 and directed by Alan Taylor. Now, we all knew that this was coming. Thor: The Dark World was going to be right at the bottom part, but you're probably wondering why haven't I put this at 23rd place. Well, it's just, I just happen to enjoy this one more than Ant-Man. Not because I think it's a great comic book movie. It's not. It's good, but it's not in the great scale. It's because of its scale and that it had a lot more action and neat visuals in the film than Ant-Man did. I just happen to have enjoyed it more. It was okay, but I did have one problem, and I usually have this with the first two Thor movies. The fish out of water comedy. The comedy in this film, I just don't like fish out of water comedy. It's never been a humour that I've particularly enjoyed or even found funny at times. There was a couple of moments where I was like, okay, that was funny, but it's been very few and few. Like, once or twice I did actually laugh. The rest of it, though, I found tedious and annoying. And especially Natalie Portman and Kat Dennings having way too much screen time in this film, and it was just painful to sit through. And the pacing of this film, while not awful, it could have been a bit quicker to get to the good stuff. And of course, here's our big problem, the villain. Malekith in this film is so bland and generic and forgettable that before rewatching this, I actually forgot his name. I really had to watch the film again just so I can remember his name, which is not a good thing to actually think about. It's a very bad thing if you can't remember the protagonist's name, the antagonist's name. But apart from those bad things, the action's great, the visuals are okay, and the acting and the chemistry between Tom Hiddleston's Loki and Chris Hemsworth's Thor is amazing. It always has been, and that's what saves the movie for me. It's not great, but it's certainly not the worst comic book film, not even for a long shot. It's just in that category as it exists. It's not going to leave a mark, it's not going to be remembered, it's just a comic book movie that happens to exist. And that's about it. That's probably it for Thor: The Dark World. It definitely has its flaws. It's definitely one of the weakest of the MCU, but it's still enjoyable enough to watch or sit through. Now, let's move on to our film in 21st place. Yes, Thor, released in 2011 and directed by Kenneth Branagh. Now, this film, I certainly have to give a lot of respect for, because it introduced us to the fantasy side of the MCU and the gargantuan scale of Asgard and its beauty, and of course Tom Hiddleston as Loki, one of the best MCU villains out there, or at the moment, an anti-hero. But of course, the fish out of water comedy is again what kills it for me, and is the reason why it's so low on this list. Now, don't get me wrong, it's enjoyable enough when it's not on Earth. When it's in Asgard, it is beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful movies you will ever watch. Kenneth Branagh really knows how to make a set look gargantuous and beautiful and grandeur. But when it gets to the Earth side of the film, with the fish out of water comedy, obviously that's where it goes downhill for me, and I'd rather just skip over them scenes just to see the Asgard bits. And while the acting from the human cast aren't awful, but they're not characters I particularly care for. And the chemistry between Chris Hemsworth and Jane Foster is non-existent. You can tell that they are just acting and they're not really becoming friends, which is a very big issue. But the rest of the film is actually pretty good. It's got good action, it's got magnificent visuals, it's got some good acting, but for a Marvel film that I love to rewatch, this just does not come to my head. But I highly recommend it for beginners of the MCU if they want to know where Thor's come from and what his origin story is and how he started out. I highly recommend it because it actually is pretty good when it's not in the fish out of water stuff. So that's all I can say for Thor. Now let's move on to our Marvel film in 20th place. Yes, Captain Marvel, release of this year of 2019 and directed by Anne Borden and Ryan Fleck. Now, this film is a mixed bag for me because when I watched the two trailers that were marketing this film, I didn't think much. I honestly thought this was going to be one of those generic origin story films that's not going to make much of an impact and it's just going to be boring throughout most of it, yada yada yada. And when I went to watch the film this March, I was right. It's exactly what it is. It's not the worst film I've ever watched. It's actually a good film, but compared to the rest of the MCU, it is just boring. Very, very boring. But now let's get to the good stuff. The humor in it is actually decent, and the performances, again, are decent. But this is where I get my big issue. Brie Larson, she did a good job with what she's been given for this film after she's gone through the first 20 minutes. Because in those first 20 minutes of the film, she seems stiff and wooden and bland. She seems too over-cocky, and that's not an enjoyable character trait. But once it gets past those first 20 minutes, she's actually a pretty relatable and enjoyable character. And the de-aging effects in this film, particularly with Samuel L. Jackson, are phenomenal. They look so convincing. They managed to make a guy who is 70 years old, well, probably nearly 70, and made him look like he's 40 again. It is so phenomenal. And what they did with the Skrulls, with the twist, this is a spoiler alert in case anybody hasn't seen the film, it is actually really clever of what they did because they were copying off the Kree Skrull War storyline from the 70s. And I know that we already established the Kree as bad guys in Guardians of the Galaxy, but we thought because the Skrulls had always been bad guys in the comics, we thought, oh, it's just going to be two bad teams. But no, they didn't do that. They actually made the Skrulls likable characters. And they're heroes as well. So I actually liked that twist. But the rest of the movie, I gotta tell you, it's just boring. I was not really entertained by it. I did enjoy watching it, but I wasn't entertained. It's just going to be one of those Phase 1 type movies, even though it's in Phase 3. And it's only existing so we know why Captain Marvel is in Avengers Endgame. But it's not going to be the most memorable MCU film. It's not even just going to be one of the MCU films that becomes a landmark in history. It's just going to be another Marvel movie that happens to exist and it's just forgettable. And that's basically what it is. Now, let's move on to our film in 19th place, and I'm just going to warn you, for some people, this one might be a little bit controversial. Yes, Black Panther, released in 2018 and directed by Ryan Coogler. Now, hear me out here. I think this movie is brilliant. I think it's got brilliant writing, brilliant sound editing, brilliant production sets, brilliant costume designing, some good acting, and some good action sequences. I think this film is one of the most mature MCU movies in the entire franchise. But there are two problems in this film that are too big to ignore, and it really knocks it down for me on this list. One, The VFX effects for a budget for this film are remarkably awful. Now, what I think that is because they spent most of the VFX money on making Wakanda look amazing. You look at Wakanda, it looks amazing. It looks so realistic. But a good example of the other VFX is the final climax. It really looks bad. You can tell how fake it is. And if they were going to give this film an Oscar, that's just bad. And now we get to my second problem. The attention it got after the film came out. I knew this film was hyped. I was hyped to see this. But after coming out of the film and then reading up how many people went crazy about it, saying, "Oh my god, it's the greatest Marvel film that's ever existed because it's a black cast." Yeah, it's a black cast. So what? We've seen plenty of superhero films and even normal films out there with black casts. So why does this make it any more different? Because it's an African country? It's a Marvel movie. It's not gonna... Look, yes, it's a black cast, and I'm not racist. I'm not even close to racist, not even for a long shot, but I know when it goes too far. I mean, when I read up that the Oscars were trying to make up a new category just so they could give this movie an award, that just went overboard. This film is not an Oscar-winning film, but it is a good achievement in the franchise. I definitely class this one of the, probably the most mature film in the MCU, and I can give it that. But the problems that it had were just too big to ignore for me, and that's why it's in 19th place. Now, let's move on to our film in 18th place. Yes, Ant-Man and the Wasp, released in 2018 and directed by Peyton Reed. Now, I consider this one a massive improvement over the first Ant-Man. I really, really do. But again, as the same with the other Ant-Man movie, the small scale is just not for me. I love comic book movies being big in scale and feeling massive. But this one, I know it's supposed to be self-centered and just very, very, very small in scale. But again, I just don't enjoy that. I see it as too boring. Now, don't get me wrong. Again, the visuals in this film are amazing for when they're tiny, and acting and humour are really good in this. And the villain is remarkably okay. But again, like most Ant-Man movies, well, there's only two, but like the other Ant-Man movie, the small scale is just too boring. And it's not that I found this film horrible or bad. It's not even that. It's a very, very good movie. But the scale, I just don't like. It's too small for me to enjoy. Half of the time, I'm just sitting through this and I'm like, can something happen? So, yeah, that was a bit of a letdown for me. Because I did really find this a massive improvement over the first Ant-Man. I really do. But again, the scale just kills the film for me. Anyway, that's about it for Ant-Man and the Wasp. Let's move on to our film in 17th place. Yes, The Incredible Hulk, released in 2008 and directed by Louis Leterrier. Now, this one is definitely the lost child of the MCU, and for a lot of reasons. It doesn't have the same tone as the rest of the MCU, it's much darker. There's not as much humour in it, and colourful visuals, and all stuff like that, but just put this into perspective. This is the second film in the MCU when they were still finding their tone, their attitude. This is where they were still finding themselves. And while Iron Man did a really good job, the Incredible Hulk didn't do as good as a job as Iron Man did. And why is that? Probably because of it being the opposite of Iron Man. While Iron Man was humorous at times and did have some colourful visuals, the Incredible Hulk was actually more serious and darker in tone. And that's what sets it apart from the rest of the MCU. This is why people consider it the lost child of the MCU. But let's look at the good stuff. The visuals are actually really good, especially on the Incredible Hulk and Abomination. They do look realistic. And what else? The action. There's only 3 action scenes in this film, but the way that they're done and stylized makes them stand out. Our first action scene is like a horror movie. The second action scene is an all-out battle with the army. And then the third action scene is like the final boss battle in a video game. How can you not put them in the pros of this film? And also, Edward Norton, he does an okay job in the role, but for me, I prefer Mark Ruffalo. Not that Edward Norton did a bad job. He did a good job with what he was given, but Mark Ruffalo just did it better for me. But in all honesty, I prefer the 2000 Lee and Hulk actor Eric Bana in the role. I just see him more as Bruce Banner. And I'm going to give you off a little guilty pleasure of mine. I enjoy 2003's Hulk. I really do. And do you know why? It's mostly just nostalgia. It's because it came out the same year I was born and I grew up with it. It's just got a lot of nostalgia for me, and it just makes it easier to sit through. Even though I know there's too much talking and not enough smashing, I just happen to enjoy sitting through it. But all in all, for this movie, I find it enjoyable for what it is, and even though it's a lost child of the MCU, I find it as a unique film. Not memorable, not bad, just unique in its own way. So that's what I can say about it. Now let's move on to our film in 16th place, and I'm just going to say this. This pick is going to be super controversial. Yes. Iron Man 2, released in 2010 and directed by Jon Favreau. Now, hear me out on this one. I know people usually put this at the very bottom of the list, either at the 23rd place or even the 22nd place. It's usually either that or Thor the Dark World. It's usually right at the bottom. And now you're probably wondering, why is it in 16th place? Why have you put it so high on your list? It's because out of the rest of the films we've just gone through, I just happen to enjoy Iron Man 2 more than I do those ones. Because of one person, Robert Downey Jr. You could put him in anything and it can just get very, very good reviews. It can make it so enjoyable. You can put bloody Robert Downey Jr. in Steel, and yet he would make the film very entertaining. You could put him in Son of the Mask and he would be brilliant. So, his charisma is brilliant. It's unmatchable compared to the rest of the MCU. And the action scenes, once it gets there, are very, very cool. Especially the Grand Prix scene. That was amazing. But then we get to our problems with the film. The biggest problem is that it tries to juggle way too many storylines and plot lines into this film. And I'm just going to give you a few of them. Not all of them, but just a few of them. We've got Tony Stark dying of heart poisoning thanks to his arc reactor. We've got Whiplash's revenge. We've got Justin Hammer's jealousy. We've got the debut of War Machine. We've got the debut of Black Widow. We've got Pepper Potts becoming CEO. That's six plot lines in one movie. That's just too much. And of course, the biggest problem was because Jon Favreau wanted to make this film in 3 years, but the studio only gave him 2 years to make this film. So he's tried to cram all of that into its deadline, which kills it. And also, the treatment of Whiplash. When Whiplash is on screen, he is so cool. And they got Mickey Rourke to play him. That is just twice as cool. But he's barely in the movie. And who is the villain we focused on? Some asshole in a suit. Just like the first Iron Man, just like the third Iron Man. The villain is always an asshole in a suit, and it gets tiring, it gets boring. We don't want that. We want to see a cool villain actually in the film. So they actually ruined that as well. But apart from those problems, I still find it enjoyable, and I do recommend it if you want to see what the second Iron Man film is like. Because it's definitely not as good as Iron Man's 3 or 1, but it certainly still is entertaining, so go ahead and watch it. It's got some good moments. Now, let's move on to our film in 15th place. Yep, Spider-Man Homecoming, released in 2017 and directed by John Watts. Now, hear me out on this one. I know a lot of people claim this is one of the better Spider-Man movies out there. And while I do agree that it's definitely one of the most rewatchable and entertaining MCU films out there, for me, it just doesn't represent Spider-Man as how I see him. Being 16 years old and growing up with the original Sam Raimi trilogy and the Mark Webb duology, they just represented Spider-Man in a way I see as realistic. In Sam Raimi, yeah, it's corny, it's silly, but it's meant to be like that. This is the Peter Parker I believe I see in a comic book. But the Mark Webb duology with Andrew Garfield, while they weren't perfect, I did see him as the Spider-Man that belonged on the big screen. We got the nerd from the original trilogy that belongs in a comic book, and we got the hipster Joker that we get in the Mark Webb duology. But this one tries to cram both of them in, and while I do respect what it was trying to do, it just too kiddie for me, you know what I mean? It's too kiddie, and I know that the original trilogy was corny and all that, but this one, I just don't enjoy as much. But it definitely gets some good things, right? I like how they focus more on Peter Parker's high school life, because we never really got that in the other two films. And also, Michael Keaton as the Vulture is one of the best MCU villains out there. He matches Killmonger, Hela, and even Thanos. So that's a very respectable villain. And being played by freaking Michael Keaton, Jesus Christ, you cannot get more perfect than that. And Tom Holland does a very good job as Spider-Man, but he's just not my favourite Spider-Man out there. And it definitely has some good visuals in there as well. And I sort of like how Peter Parker's suit is a bit more high-tech because Tony Stark made it for him. It's got his own AI, it's got its all that lot, all these gadgets. I do actually enjoy that. But for the rest of the movie, with it being a bit more kiddie than the other Spider-Man or even the MCU movies, that's just where I don't enjoy it as much. So I might be being a bit harsh, but that's just my opinion on Spider-Man Homecoming. Still a good movie though, I highly recommend it for Spider-Man fans. Now let's move on to our film in 14th place. Iron Man. Released in 2008 and directed by Jon Favreau. Now, hear me out on this one. I give this film tons of respect for what it started, for what it created, and for what it was able to start. Jon Favreau is definitely the granddaddy of the MCU, and Robert Downey Jr. is the cornerstone of it. And it managed to set an entire cinematic universe while not doing what usual cinematic universes do with their first movie. They always set up the sequels. This one didn't. It had an occasional Easter egg, but it focused on being its own movie. What other cinematic universes need to do? You look at the cinematic universes like the DC Extended Universe or the Universal Monster movies, they always had the same problem. Always focus on setting up the sequels rather than focusing on the first movie, which is always a very common mistake. But this film managed to not do that, and I highly respect it for it. And it gave us Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, probably the most perfect casting choice, right next to Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So this is why I give the film so much respect. But the reason why I put it at 14th place today is because compared to the rest of the MCU movies we've got, it seems very small scale, doesn't it? Now that's not a bad thing, because this is the first film of a very huge cinematic universe. But then when you see the Marvel movies that we've got now, like with the Avengers movies and Guardians of the Galaxy, and even later Thor movies, you look at the first Iron Man and it's like, yeah, it's a great movie, but it just seems quite smaller than I remember. You get what I mean? So it's not that I find this film bad or unenjoyable. It's not even close to those distinctions. It's very good and very enjoyable, but it just pales in comparison to the rest of the MCU because they got bigger and better. Well, some of them. But I respect you, Iron Man. You managed to start a cinematic universe we will never get sick of. Iron Man, we're going to miss you, buddy. We are going to miss you. Now, let's move on to our film in 13th place. Yes, Captain America the First Avenger, released in 2011 and directed by Joe Johnston. Now, this film, again, is one of the most unique films in the MCU because it's the only war movie in this film, and it's set in the 1940s. Joe Johnston, for some reason, just has a remarkable connection to the 1940s aesthetic, and in this film, it is beautiful. I remember reading up on World War II and all that, and the 40s just seemed like a horrible time to live in, and while it was, the way that the film makes the 1940s look, it looks remarkably beautiful. And the performances and the action scenes in this film, again, are really, really good. But what makes me put this film in only 13th place is its villain. I find the Red Skull very entertaining. In fact, I find him one of the best MCU villains in this entire franchise. But I don't know. It's something about him. Probably when he reveals he's the Red Skull, the way that his Red Skull looks, it looks too fake. You know, it looks just too plasticky, and it just looks like a mask. I mean, I remember the 1990s Red Skull looking a lot better than that because it looked fleshy, it looked scarred, it looked like an actual skull. This, while it does look like a skull, looks too fake, and that just really puts it so far. But apart from that, this film is so unique, it's memorable. I love this film so much that it makes me love the 1940s. That is a hard thing for a kid my age to actually do. So that's why I respect this film. It's got brilliant action, brilliant visuals, beautiful 1940s aesthetic. But there's also another problem as well. The first hour of this film with the origin story is amazing. It's one of the most enjoyable hours of my life, just watching this origin story. But then when it gets to the second hour, it skips over a lot of Captain America being in World War II, so we can get to see him fight the Red Skull. But I actually wanted to see him go through World War II, not just like a montage of clips, his actual journey throughout World War II, because it would be a bit more unique of how the war affected him. So, it's probably a thing we're never going to get to see, but I really did enjoy this film, and I highly recommend it for Captain America fans. Now, let's move on to our film in 12th place. Yes, Spider-Man Far From Home, released in 2019 of this year, and directed by John Watts. Now, this one is a massive improvement over Homecoming for me, and I do consider it one of the best Spider-Man movies. But now let's get to the reasons why. Because of three simple reasons. The humor's jacked up to 2. You know, it's jacked up twice as much as Homecoming. So is the action, and so are the visuals. These action scenes and these visuals are so beautiful to look at and so enjoyable. They make Homecoming's action look like, God, that's a bit lackluster, isn't it? And the humour in this film, there were a lot of moments where I laughed my freaking head off. Because in the Homecoming film, there weren't a lot of it, except for one joke, where Ned said he was watching porn. But apart from that, this film was a lot funnier. And Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio. Mysterio in this movie is such a remarkable villain. Like, in the first half of this film, I really did feel for the character. I mean, I know he's the bad guy, and I knew they were going to do this twist even before the film was announced and they were putting him in it. But the way they treated him as like a superhero really made you feel for the character. When you see the twist, you feel so betrayed. And then when you get to the final act of the film, he goes to your typical bad guy, which sort of ruins it for me. But I still find him one of the best MCU villains at the moment. And, well, you know, this is coming off the death of Tony Stark in Avengers Endgame as well, so it's got a lot to live up to, but it handles it in a right way because we're seeing Spider-Man's reaction to living in a world without his mentor, which can be hard for a lot of people. It's like someone losing their father figure and having to live in a world where you don't have that mentor anymore. It's hard to go through, and we actually feel Spider-Man and what he's going through. So they do give a powerful message off. And of course, spoiler alert here, we get the best surprise in this film, and it's mid-credit scene with J.K. Simmons returning as J. Jonah Jameson. Holy shit, this is what we wanted, and I love this film so much for it. So thank you, Spider-Man Far From Home. Definitely one of the best Spider-Man films out there. Now, let's move on to our film in 11th place. Yes, Captain America the Winter Soldier, released in 2014 and directed by the Russo brothers. Now, you're probably thinking, why have I put this at only 11th place, not even in the top 10? Well, I'm going to get to that bit in a minute, but I just want to go through the good stuff first. The Russo brothers just seem to do no wrong for this franchise. They've done Captain America the Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame. 4 of the best Marvel films to ever exist in reality. And this was their first one. And it's amazing. It's got better action, better emotion, better aesthetics than Captain America the First Avenger. I know I said the 40s aesthetic was great and it feeling like a 1940s serial, but this film completely changes it to a 1970s spy thriller. How do you do that? That is amazing. The action in this film as well is so well choreographed. It's amazing. And wow, it is just amazing, this film. But I do have one issue. I think they could have done a little bit more with the Winter Soldier. Now, what they do with the Winter Soldier is fine enough. It makes him for enough entertaining villain. But I just feel like they could have done a little bit more where we dive into his backstory. We do see a little bit of it, but I would love to have seen more and feel the trauma that he had to experience while doing these sick things for the Nazis while he was secretly infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D. So, I wish we could have seen more of that. But what they've done with the villain was fine enough, so I can say that. But this film is definitely one of the most important MCU films to exist, and I totally agree with that. But for my top 10, it just narrowly misses it out, unfortunately. But that's about it. Now let's move on to our top 10. Here's our film in 10th place. Yes, the original Avengers, released in 2012 and directed by Joss Whedon. Now you're probably thinking, out of the 4 Avengers films, and usually people put in Avengers Age of Ultron below the other 3, why put the original on only 10th place? Well, I'm going to just get to that now. I think the first third of this movie, while is good, is kind of slow. Now don't get me wrong, it is enjoyable seeing these people get together and them working off each other. But we want to see the big action. That's what we've been looking forward to in the trailers. So it's a bit slow in its own way. But I'm just going to say this. When I went to see this movie with my dad in 2012, it's one of the best surprises I have ever had at the cinema in my entire life. I just remember seeing the first scene of this film and being, did that just happen? That is amazing! I really thought this film was so amazing, especially the final acts of this film. I was just blown away by how awesome it was. But then again, compared to the other Avengers films for me, while this is still a really great film, the others I just happen to enjoy more. Not that this one's bad, it's a very, very good film. It's just, if the first third wasn't as slow as it is, it probably would be higher. Heck, even in the top 5 if I wanted to. So that's probably why it's only at the 10th spot. But I still really recommend this for Avengers fans. It is a good way to start off and end Phase 1. Now, let's get to our film in 9th place. Yes, Doctor Strange, released in 2016 and directed by Scott Derrickson. Now, before I watched this film, I didn't really know much about Doctor Strange. I didn't read the comics. I knew who the character was because I had seen him in cartoons. And he had made a few appearances in other comic books that I had owned. But I didn't really know much about the character. I wasn't really interested in knowing much about him. Even when the trailer was released, I was like, alright, it looks cool. But I'm not really interested in Doctor Strange. But then when I watched the film, I was blown away by how much I actually enjoyed it. I was like, wow, that was actually really, really good. I'm surprised how much I love that film. Because of its direction being brilliant and the visuals being probably the most creative in the entire MCU. And of course, Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange is another perfect casting choice. But again, my problem for this movie is quite a big one, but it doesn't ruin the film for me. The villain Caecilius. Caecilius is a very forgettable villain, and again, his name was actually so hard to remember. I mean, you try watching a film with a villain named Caecilius and actually remembering his name as soon as you finish the film. You'd be like, hey, the villain was actually quite bad. What was his name again? Was it Caecilius? No, Caecilius? What was his name? So Caecilius is a hard name to remember, and he's a very forgettable villain. We can just say that. But this film is very creative, very weird, but in a very good, weird way. And of course, one of the most enjoyable things in this film for me is the Ancient One. Seeing her die in this film was very upsetting for me, but when I saw her again in Avengers Endgame, I was like, alright, I'm happy. As long as I get to see this character one more time, I am so happy. Because I love this character so much. She's a brilliant actress, and she really defined this role for me. So, Doctor Strange is definitely one of my favourite MCU movies, and that's why it's in 9th spot. And now let's move on to our film in 8th place. Yep, Captain America Civil War, released in 2016 and directed by the Russo brothers. Now, again, hear me out on this one. I know usually people put this in like the top 3, but it's just the 7 movies that are going to come after this spot, I just found more entertaining. Now, don't get me wrong, I really found this film amazing. It's a very great film because of the ideologies of Captain America and Iron Man. Because when they're going through the Superhero Registration Act, or in this film it's called the Sokovia Accords, we've got Iron Man accepting it, thinking that if the heroes had a bit background from the government, they get more respect back that they need. While Captain America oppresses it because he thinks they will destroy their free will. So you understand both their ideologies, and you're actually torn yourself about who you should choose your side for it. But for me, I gotta go for Team Iron Man. I just understand that if they got a little bit more public backing from the government, I think it wouldn't be so bad. So, I'm just Team Iron Man. And also, the action scenes in this film are so perfectly made. Especially the airport battle and the final battle between Captain America the Winter Soldier and Iron Man. Which is definitely hard to watch because you don't want to see these 3 fight. You want to see them be friends. So it is hard to watch, but at the same time, it's amazing to watching it. It's so amazing. And they managed to introduce 2 new superheroes, Black Panther and Spider-Man, in the same movie without it becoming overstuffed. I mean, that's like a near impossible task, and yet they managed to do it. So I respect this movie for it. But the reason why it's only in 8th place is again because of its villain. Baron Zemo, while not a forgettable villain, he's just not very memorable looking. I remember reading the Captain America comics and seeing Baron Zemo in this, campy looking getup with the red purplish hood, and it was so cool in my eyes. And well, seeing him in this film without it, he just came across as a normal guy, and he was completely overshadowed by the hero's action. But now that we've got the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV series coming up, and we actually see Baron Zemo returning with the red purplish hood, I'm okay now. But this is why it's only on 8th place. This is why it's on 8th place. Now, let's move on to our film in 7th place. Yes, Thor Ragnarok, released in 2017 and directed by Taika Waititi. Now, after what the 2 first Thor movies were like, again, I wasn't expecting much. I heard that it was announced, and I'm like, God, another Thor movie? Alright, no, I'm not going to watch it. It's going to be shit. But when I saw the teaser trailer, I quickly changed my mind. Because not only did I see Thor's hammer Mjolnir get destroyed by Hela, the goddess of death, I saw Thor on Sakaar, I saw him with a new haircut, and I saw him about to fight the Incredible Hulk. Holy shit, what anticipation this film had. And when I watched it, it exceeded my expectations. Not only was it action-packed and visually beautiful, The humor in this film is just bloody genius. Taika Waititi completely redefined Thor as a fan favourite. But then this is where my issue comes. The humour can get a little bit too much. It can be in too many scenes, and when we need an emotional scene, yeah, they cram a joke into it, and it just sort of ruins the moment. Like when you're seeing, Surtur destroy Asgard, it's supposed to be very emotional, but then you see Hulk fighting him, and while I admit it is funny, it just ruined an emotional moment. So those emotional moments that we needed being ruined by the humour, they could have had their humour a little bit lower in scale. But that's my only problem, because they also got Karl Urban, the guy who perfected Dredd, into this film, a Scourge. It was perfect. Karl Urban can do no wrong again. He made Doom a little bit entertaining. So him being in this was so entertaining. And Hela, played by Cate Blanchett, again, she's one of the best MCU villains to date. And I heard she might be reprising her role for the 4th Thor film. So we'll see how that goes. That's about it. It's a very entertaining, funny, fun Marvel movie. And I definitely recommend it for people who actually want to see a good Thor movie. So that's it for that film. Now let's move on to our film in 6th place. Yes, Guardians of the Galaxy, released in 2014 and directed by James Gunn. Now, while most people found this film was going to be a huge failure for Marvel and that they were making a very stupid decision, me being 11 years old at the time, I thought, no, actually, I think this is going to be a good idea. I think this is going to be a unique, funny, memorable Marvel movie. And when I watched it, I was completely correct. It was funny, it was unique, it was very, very memorable, and it will be one of my all-time favourite Marvel movies. And to be honest, the only reason I wanted to go and watch it is because they had Dave Bautista in the movie. Because at this point, I was a huge fan of WWE. I'm not joking. From 2007 to 2014, I was on that hype train all the time. But after 2014, and I noticed that it was starting to get faker and faker. I've sort of just gone off that train a little bit. I still watch it and all that. I like to catch up, but I don't watch it as much. But this film was so surprising for me. Even though I knew it was going to be good, it was so amazing. We got bloody Chris Pratt, who I'm surprised by his body transformation, plays Star-Lord, and they managed to make a film good with a talking raccoon and a tree, with him being the breakout character. So props to this movie for being super awesome and badass. And the villain, Ronan the Accuser, while some people find him bland and silly looking, you know what? I enjoyed him. It's the sort of villain I love to hate. And he's easy to hate, I'm not gonna lie. So, yeah, sue me. I enjoyed Ronan. That's all I'm gonna say. And now, we're gonna move on to our movie in 5th place. And I'm just gonna say this now. This is probably gonna be my most controversial placing on this list. So let's have a look. Yep, let all the booze soak in. Iron Man 3, released in 2013 and directed by Shane Black. I know this film is hated so much, but not as much as Iron Man 2. But you're probably wondering why, of all of the movies, is this in my top 5? Well, I'm just going to go ahead and say I find it one of the most entertaining and awesome MCU movies I've watched. For me, they did Iron Man sort of right in this film, because we're seeing Iron Man without his gadgets and his house being destroyed and him having to live off the street. This is just like following the 1984 comic storyline of Deliverance. So it's got a good touch. And also, the final action scene. The action scenes in this film are bloody amazing. And the humour in this film as well. Very Shane Blacky, but it's very, very funny. I love this film. And, of course, the charisma of Robert Downey Jr. is brilliant. But, of course, I've got one problem with it. It's the villain. But it's not the reason why you think. It probably is, but for some of you, probably not. Now, I know the Mandarin twist in this film is very, very hated, and people have called it the biggest what the fuck moment in comic book history. But when I saw the twist of Ben Kingsley's Middle Eastern terrorist Mandarin not being the real Mandarin, I found it funny. I wasn't pissed off by the choice. I actually thought it was very funny and very well directed. But, of course, with Guy Pearce's Aldrich Killian, who in the Extremis storyline is in it for 2 panels and shoots himself in the head, never to be seen again, as the villain in this film, is very confusing to me, because I didn't really find him compelling. And also, I do agree that changing the Mandarin from an Asian alien with 10 power rings from a Middle Eastern terrorist is a weird choice, but actually a smart choice comparing this day and age, and making him not the real Mandarin. I just find funny. I really do. It's not a moment that pisses me off so much, but I do find it funny. I honestly do. And that's it for Iron Man 3. You know, I find it the most entertaining of the Iron Man films, and that's about it. Now let's move on to our film in 4th place, which again, for some of you out there, might be a little bit controversial. Yes, Avengers Age of Ultron, released in 2015 and directed by Joss Whedon. Now, I know people usually call this the least good Avengers film, because it's not a bad film. It's a very good film. It's very entertaining, but I do get the problems of what people say about it. It's definitely overstuffed and probably one of the most complicated MCU movies to follow, because the storyline does have a lot of stuff going on. But this film has a lot of enjoyable things, particularly being Marvel's most expensive film ever, with $365.5 million in its budget. That's a lot of money. But the visuals in this movie are beautiful. The action is very amazing. It's got some very funny moments, brilliant performances, especially the villain Ultron, played by James Spader. Holy shit, is that a funny yet intimidating villain. I got nothing much to say. I know it's overstuffed, but I don't give a shit. I find this film one of the most entertaining Marvel films out there, and you can sue me if you want, but I love this film so much. And now, we're up to our top 3. And before we get started, again, you probably know we've only got 3 films left. We've got the 2 Avengers movies, Infinity War and Endgame, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And you probably know what are going to be the top 2, but, you know, let's just move on to top 3 anyway. And here's the movie that's taken the bronze medal. Yes, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, released in 2017 and directed by James Gunn. Now, this is a fascinating film, really, because there are 2 groups. We've got the one group that loves the first movie, but finds the second one okay. And then we've got the other group that finds the second one great, and the first one okay. For me, I'm in this group. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I find is a significant improvement over the first one. Why is that? I'll tell you why. The humour's jacked up to 10, the action's jacked up to 10, the visuals, the performances, all of it jacked up to 10. This is probably the funniest Marvel movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You can try to disagree with me, but in my opinion, it's the funniest one out there. And also, the villain, played by Kurt freaking Russell, as Star-Lord's father, a living celestial planet. That is just awesome. And he's very unique in a way because he smiles. We love him at first. He seems like a great guy. But there's something about him that's off. Like, it doesn't seem anything's wrong with him, but there's something wrong with him. And then obviously we find out what a psychopath he is, which makes it very sad as well because we built a connection with him as well. So the way they handled the villain was very, very smart. And I really don't find an issue with this film. These 3 films, like this one and the ones that are coming after, I have no significant big problems with. Well, maybe my second one, but it doesn't matter. I find this film the perfect Guardians of the Galaxy film, And I just got to see what the third one's going to be like, because I don't think it'll top this one for me. This just seems like the perfect comedy comic book movie for me. And that's all I'll say. I actually find it funnier than the Deadpool movies, which might be a controversial thought, but it doesn't matter. Now, it's come to the big deciding point. Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Probably the biggest films in this entire universe. But which one's taking the silver and which one's taking the gold? Well, it was very hard to think about, because before I did this list, they were tied. I was going to put these both in first place. But then after I rewatched them, there is one problem I find with one of them. And it pains me to do this, but here's our film who's taking the silver medal. Yeah, oh, it kills me to say this. My film in second place is Avengers Endgame, released in 2019 and directed by the Russo brothers. Now, I love this film so much. It is a once-in-a-lifetime cinematic event. When I saw this film, I was so satisfied. It's probably the best conclusion to any other franchise. I'm talking better than the bloody Harry Potter franchise. I think the action sequences, the musical score, the visuals, the emotional weight of the story are all done perfect. And the performances are very, very phenomenal. But there is one problem that I do have, and it's sort of a nitpick. The treatment of Thor. Now, I know Thor's suffering through post-traumatic stress disorder, and he's going through a lot of stress eating and guilt over that he weren't able to kill Thanos before he did the snap. But if we think about it, it just, throughout the rest of the film, it just seemed too comedic for me. I mean, I get he's going through some trouble, and we want a little bit of humour in the film, since it's going to be a darker tone. But if we're going to give characters humour, just leave it to like Ant-Man or War Machine or anything like that. The ones that the humour belongs to. And now I know it's necessary for Thor to go through this, because I get it. Because if you were the result of something causing a huge world problem, and it's on you, you're the person who's caused it. Like, you could have stopped it, but you failed in doing so. And that guilt is just on you. I completely get it. And when it's going through the emotional scenes, I really feel for Thor. And in the climax, where he's at his most powerful with Mjolnir and Stormbreaker, he's a freaking badass. It's just in his comedic scenes, well, yeah, I do find funny, and they did make me laugh out loud when I saw what Thor looked like. It just didn't fit the character for me. I mean, like I said, I do love Thor Ragnarok's humour, and Thor as well, being humorous. But when he looks like a god, yeah, it fits. But seeing him like this, it just didn't suit me. Just too comedic for the film's tone. But the rest of this film, I love so much, and I will never get bored of watching this. And that means we've got one film left. That's right, let's look at our number one champion who's took the crown. Avengers Infinity War, released in 2018 and directed by the Russo brothers. This film, for me, is the perfect superhero movie to ever exist. Why, you ask? Because this has been building up since the first Avengers movie, all the way back in 2012. Every film afterwards has been building up to this particular moment. And when we got sick of waiting for Thanos and thinking, oh, he's just going to be a generic bad guy who wants to kill half of the planet to impress Lady Mistress Death. But no. I know this film's called Avengers, but this is Thanos' movie. They make him the most compelling, enrichful character you will ever get as a villain. You feel for him, and you understand his motives. The world is becoming overpopulated and there's not enough to go around. And he sees as wiping out half of it going to balance the universe. While his motives seem very evilish, you understand the reason why he's doing it, and you're feeling the pain that he's having to go through to make it happen. Like when he's getting the Soul Stone, he has to sacrifice the last person he loves just so he can make his destiny actually happen, because he sees that it's doing the right thing. My God, he's just the perfect villain. And of course, the usual, the performances, the musical score, the visuals, the action sequences, the scale of this film, and the tone are all perfect in this movie. You cannot get more perfect than this. Holy shit, I love this movie. It'll be my #1 champion ever for Marvel, and I don't think it'll ever be topped in my lifetime. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching my channel. I hope you enjoyed the ranking, even though some of the choices I put on might be a little bit controversial to see some out there. But it doesn't matter because it's my opinion. I know it's not the official the official ranking, but it's my opinion, and that's how I see the movies. And if you want, don't forget to comment down below your ranking of the list so I can look down on it. So I can look at it and see what you thought of the movies. And also don't forget to subscribe to my channel, because again, I really need more subscribers, man. Jesus Christ, I've only got 12. I need a lot more than that. And my next franchise that I'm probably going to rank, I probably don't know. It's probably going to take me a while to think about it. Might be a DC one or another Marvel one, I have no clue. Or it might not even be a comic book one. It might be a horror, comedy, or action. We have no idea. We'll just have to see. So again, thank you so much for watching. I'm Lakin22, and this has been the Lakin22 Movie Chat.